Why, thank you for letting me know. Hannah Joy is here. Good to see you. Let's see if anybody else here that I don't know. No. Brian Vaughn. Very good. Why did the Zadokite calendar fall out of use? Well, it didn't really fall out of use. I guess you might say it was stolen and hidden, but we'll try to get down to the reasons that it came out of use and reasons why it should come back in, which we'll do again next time we get on this subject. For the reasons of the calendar change, they're obscure, as is the political history of the times. We take what crumbs we have, and we work to make them into the image of the cake they came from. I've been studying these crumbs for a long time, and in the meantime, I've been putting out lectures of what I've found. Probably at least a dozen lectures now, and Norman has helped me on several of those. And in fact, we had a debate on one of them. Of course, he won. He always does. The subject comes up in my mind very often. I think about it as I try to make that cake. And I'm afraid I might get far into the subject and never end talking about it. I've learned a lot. It's just a matter of speculating to put it all together. The crumbs we've found are in a few biblical books. We studied the Maccabees, both 1 and 2, especially Maccabees the second. And in Daniel, we leave the Bible and we go to Josephus, both in his wars and in his antiquities. There's some stuff. It's contradictory stuff, but you know Josephus. Also, in obscure passages of the Masoretic Tanakh, that's your Old Testament from the Hebrew, which everybody is pretty well assured now that it's been redacted somewhere in the past among the Masoretes. And there are some things missing and some things changed, but there are still obscure traces of the Zadokite calendar in there that we can still ferret out. And far more we find in the scriptures rejected by the Pharisees and the Christians, like Jubilees, Ezekiel, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Do you think when the Pharisees put together the canon, they might have just wanted to hide something away? The best witnesses of them all for the actual workings of the calendar is the text, Mixat Ma'asa HaTorah, or you may have heard it called the MMT, at least part 1 of the MMT, in which the festival days are spelled out, and the way in which we derive those days is also pretty easy to figure. And I have a translation of that, Mixat Ma'asa HaTorah, right here, that we'll probably refer to if there's time. Also, 1 Enoch 72 and following, and I might say I've done translations of both of these texts. The whole book of Enoch, you'll find it's different. It's Hebraic. If you want one, just drop me a line here or send me a chat with your email address, and I'll shoot it over to you. And that goes for the Mixat Ma'asa HaTorah as well. Let me know you want it. Give me an email address, and you'll get it probably before the night's over. I'll try to go as far as I can with the history tonight, at least a bunch of factoids that you can put together and speculate on your own. Well, as long as my time and strength permit. In the next section, then, I'll deal only with the Zadokite Enoch calendar. And I hope, Norman, that you would take the time, and any of you that know something about the calendar would take the time to be a part of that meeting whenever it is, probably next week at the same time, maybe tomorrow night, who knows. All right, I made the whole political process into a short story for you. So if you want to hang up on me after about 5 or 10 minutes, well, you'll still know. Okay, and here's that story. Once upon a time, there was a civil war in Israel, started by an invasion of the temple by the king of the empire to the east. Many of the Jews liked the life of the kingdom to the east and would have liked very much to see that king bring the fullness of his culture into Israel to replace what they thought was the overpowering religious power of the clergy who ran the country. We could all do better with a modern king than an old-fashioned priest, they thought. However, the clergy had some great strengths in a family of poor priests known as the Hammers, who put together a ragtag army and struck back successfully. The Hammers eventually persuaded the rank and file to expel the king and his armies, and they did. The Hammers consisted of 5 brothers who then took over the government and against their traditional religion took over the religion too, passing the high priesthood between themselves. The last of the brothers made himself king, commander of the army, and great high priest. He was not qualified for this. He sold back the country to his enemies, who forced their culture upon the Israelites with the help of a new cooperating priesthood who rejected the traditional way, including the legitimate priestly family, the holidays, and the calendar. There was a lot of money to be made by some if only the calendar could be changed to that of the king of the East. Then imperial markets would come open. And from that day forward, for the next 150 years, the people were subjugated, the religion was polluted, and God wasn't pleased. Finally, the prophecy came that Israel would be invaded and destroyed by God. And soon enough, that prophecy came true, the day of the Lord. And nobody lived happily ever after there again. And that's the story. That's the story, really in a nutshell. The king of the East, of course, is the Seleucid Empire, and that king personally is Antiochus Epiphanes, whom you may have heard of as the little horn of Daniel, I think chapter 7. But in regards to the main factions in that civil war, which was going on between about 167 BC and 160, a lot of things changed then. Of course, before Messiah. A lot of things changed during the course of that, and really the whole government of Israel was usurped, and that usurpation, I think that's it, usurpation continued until Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. And as we have studied the history of Yeshua many, many times, insofar as we have that, and even the Jewish war that he predicted to happen 40 years after his demise, we probably know a whole lot of what had happened 160 years before did to affect their future. It's astounding what it did. Now, the rebellion or the civil war took place, as I mentioned, starting in about 175 BC and following. I think I said 167 BC, but the intrigues were those few years before that. Things happened that simply were unthinkable in Israel, which we'll go over in a minute. The factions were the Maccabees, whom I called hammers in my little story, and the Sadducees, another faction. The Sadducees, let me explain. When the Zadokite priesthood was exiled, this new illegitimate priesthood came in, and they kept the name Zadokite, but they took it from Greek instead of Hebrew. And that's how they became Sadducees, for they were sad, you see. Oh, you've heard that before. But Sadducee and Zadokite, they're the same word coming from two different languages. But the Sadducees have come to be known, people that only valued the Torah, didn't believe in an afterlife or messiahs or anything else. Whereas the Zadokites were very much like we've read about groups like the Essenes and the Nazarenes, but they were of the family of Zadok, the high priest under the time of David. That family had stayed in the priesthood for a long, long time, about 800 years. And so the usurping priesthood kept the same name that they didn't really own. That is, instead of Zadokites, they became Sadducees. Another faction here was the Pharisees. Pharisees, we learn a lot about in the New Testament, that they were pretty much Yeshua's enemies. They wanted to kill him, well, primarily because he was a Zadokite priest. Yeshua proves in his genealogy that we find in the New Testament that he was a Zadokite priest, and I'll show you where before this is all over, hopefully. So the Pharisees, people wonder, what's the origin of the word Pharisee? Well, have you ever heard of Farsi, a language? It's the language of Pharsia, which is Parthia, which is also known as Persia, where they have a religion called Zoroastrianism. And we understand that the Pharisees were foreigners that came in from Parthia with the beliefs of the Zoroastrians. Some of those beliefs we still hold today, like the resurrection of the dead. We wouldn't find that in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew religion. We got that from Parthia and Zoroastrianism and our dualist understanding that there are good and there are bad powers, both fighting each other and even inside of us. We got that also via the Pharisees from Parthia. Now, let me ask you, what is the name of that empire to the east? Well, it was known as Parthia. That's the empire to the east. In the time that we are studying now, it's called the Seleucid Empire. You'll hear that a few times during this hour. Seleucid Empire, after one of the generals of Alexander the Great, who came and conquered that area. When Alexander died, his general Seleucus took over that area, and now we're into that about 150 years after his death. Some say he choked on a piece of pork. Well, maybe that's the case. Sounds appropriate. So we've got the Seleucid Empire, the empire of the East, just east of Israel, always vying to come into Israel. And I might say there's an empire to the west too, called the Ptolemaic Empire. That's the empire of the pharaohs. And it was named after another of Alexander's generals that took over Egypt when Alexander died, Ptolemy. And they were always looking to move into Israel too. But they were friendly with Israel. They were like the United States and Ukraine at this time. They helped while the Empire of the East fought. And they were another faction, the Ptolemaic Empire, but we won't get into them very much because they don't have a whole lot to do with this whole situation of the Maccabean War or the Great First Jewish Revolt. And then we have the Zadokites themselves, also known in the books of Maccabees as the Hasidim, the pious, known not appropriately in our day as the Essenes. Okay, so when you think Zadokites, the allies of the Zadokites at that time were who we would call Essenes, but of course they never called themselves that. They called themselves Hasidians or Hasidim, not to be confused with Hasidians of today. There is really no comparison between the two. Zadokites, of course, they followed the priesthood of the family of that first Zadok priest. Zadok the priest was his name in the time of David. He has a very strange story, which I'm going to share with you in a little bit of time. And the other faction finally here were Hellenists. The Hellenists were Jews that wanted the Greek ways. They wanted their gymnasiums. They wanted their lack of shame when they went naked. They wanted to be able to be sexual deviants. They thought this was pretty good. They liked Greek architecture. They liked Greek statues. And they thought if they could be in the milieu of the Greeks, then their status in the world would be much higher. Those were Hellenists. Yeshua had them in his time too. In fact, I reckon that several of his disciples were Hellenists. And you might remember that Philip, who does himself have a Greek name, which means in Greek, horse lover. So old horse lover came to Yeshua one time and he said, "Hey, these Greeks over here want to speak to you, Yeshua." Do you remember what Yeshua did? He ignored them. He just ignored them. There must have been a reason. So those are the factions: the Maccabees, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zadokites, Hasidians in Maccabee books, and the Hellenists. That's why we call this Maccabean War a civil war, because it wasn't just the Jews against the Greeks, not at all. There were factions of both types of Jews, those that were for Greece and those that were for the Zadokite priesthood, which was eventually expelled, as you probably know. Thank you. Now I have a glossary of things and people that I'll be speaking about. And I want to go through some terms and people, things and people that need to be defined first, or it won't make very little sense when I'm going to say the rest. If you have questions or comments, please just break in. If they're not appropriate, that's okay. I'll just kick you off of here. What power? What power? It's like my own little kingdom to the north. Let's start with the A's. mention Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, he's the king of the East that we've been talking about. Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus was the name of one of the founders and one of the generals of Alexander's armies years before. Epiphanes is a Greek word, and it's taken as a surname for Antiochus, which means something like God made manifest, the face of God on this earth. And he was of that same disposition, very devilish. He's called the little horn, greatly minimized in the book of Daniel. King of the Seleucid Empire to the east of Israel in this particular time of the Hasmonean or Maccabean revolt. And this is the personification of those that the Maccabeans went against. And again, that war went on for 7 years, 167 BC to 160 BC. Remember, the years work backwards in those days. So this is about 160 years before the birth of Yahshua. If that will help you get into the swing of where in time. Remember, that's the time when God was silent. Those 400 years that the church told us that God was silent and that we shouldn't be looking at the books that came out of those years. But now we're disobedient. We must look because we've got to know it's our eternity that is in the balance here. Oh, before I cry, let me go on to the Hasmoneans. Hasmon was the name of the grandfather of the Maccabee brothers. 5 Maccabee brothers and a nephew was part of it. Hasmoneans, they took the name of their grandfather, and they're known in biblical lore by their grandfather's name. Hasmoneans, in this context, are those people involved or supporting the Maccabees during this revolt, this civil war. Next subject here would be festival calendars used in Israel and in the 1st century AD. Listen, how I got on this track about calendars was that another minister and I decided that we were going to go to all lengths to find out what is the appropriate calendar. We in our group had gone through several calendars to the point of being ridiculous, honestly. It was almost every other month. He was the boss, so he told us what calendar. I wasn't the boss, but I think I was the only guy that would do what he asked. So we started looking for the real calendar. And I said, what philosophy are you going to take in this? He said, I'm going to go back to the ancient books. I'm going to dig through those ancient books and I'm going to figure it out. He said, what are you going to do? I said, look, if there was the right or perfect calendar, wouldn't Yahshua be using it? No matter what was going on in the culture, no matter what the political flavor was of that day, wouldn't Yahshua be doing the right thing? And so that is the board I stepped off of into this quest, I don't know, about a dozen years ago. And if Yahshua would do it, and there's any clues to a calendar that Yahshua will use, it turns out that there's many, then that would be the calendar that would be right. Is that solid? Is that a good way to go? It turned out really good for me because the first place I looked was in the Jewish dictionary under calendars. And go take a look sometime if you have one. Jewish Dictionary, or the Dictionary of Judaism. Because what I learned there was that there wasn't just a calendar, just a temple calendar. The official festival calendar of the 1st century AD in Israel, it was also used not just for feasts, but for secular purposes as well. It was the lunisolar, or it's the Greek secular calendar is what it was. I don't want to go into much the lunisolar way of doing things or putting down a calendar, except to say that the Sabbaths will change month to month, or maybe 3 months to 3 months. The Sabbaths change to another day. And there are certain moons that they look at, what phase the moon is in, to figure out when the first day of the week is or whatever. I'm not really all that familiar with it, except I've done a couple things on nullifying it. And everyone used that for both feasts and for secular work, doctor's appointments, when they had to go see the psychiatrist, that kind of thing. But people differed at that time in their choice of festival calendars. Everybody used that for doctor's appointment, lunisolar, because that was the secular calendar. Their festival calendars were different. There were at least 3 that I could find going on at that same time. It's kind of like what you do, right? You don't look at the secular calendar to find out when you're going to have the Feast of Sukkot, especially if you're not on the Jewish moon calendar. You're not going to look there. You've got to look at their calendar, because they calculate that calendar and you have nothing to do with it, and you can't do anything. You have to take it or leave it. And when they say, this is the one used in the tabernacle and in the temple, you just believe it. Well, not you personally, but most people do. Most people are just followers. But while the followers of the Sadducees used it for temple business, holidays, and so forth, the followers of the Pharisees secretly, maybe not so secretly, used the observation calendar for their feasts, not for their secular work, for their feasts. The observation calendar, which if we get to it, we'll talk about later, you all probably know what it is. And then the Essenic types, like Yahshua, like the Nazarenes, like the Enochians, they still used the Zadokite calendar. There was still a very strong faction of people who would follow the Zadokites, even though they had been expelled years before. Anybody could get a Zadokite calendar because, well, as some scholars today say, it's the perfect calendar. Now, at least these 3, if not more, were used all at the same time, with these special calendars, depending on denomination, used just for the feasts. And of course, that led to some confusion, as each faction had way different festival dates, for sure. And being on the Zadokite calendar now for about a dozen years, hey, we see those. We're certainly not in the majority. But, I took a poll a couple of months back of the people that I know on YouTube who are interested in this. And from that poll, 60% used one calendar, and 30% used the Zadokite calendar. So I'm thinking in the last decade, users of the Zadokite calendar are really multiplying, because I think they're waiting. I think they're waiting. Now, wait a minute. I need somebody to be a co-host. I'm going to ask you, Bryant, since you're there. I don't know if you're there or not. I want to make you co-host so when people come on here, you can click them in. Okay? Thank you. Thank you. Did you imagine that there were several feast calendars going on in the time of Jesus? Well, you have to look closely at the text to see it. A lot of scholars have been looking at the 3 days between Yahshua's demise and his resurrection, and they're seeing full well that that had to come from the Zadokite calendar and no place else to make it 3 days. Well, that's for you to figure out and for you to teach me. The next topic we have here and word to know is Hasidians, which I talked a little about earlier, also called Hasidim. The word means the pious, whatever that means. Pious basically means religious people. It's a faction in the Maccabean revolt. And it's probably the proto-Essenes. We don't know for sure, but there's so much affinity between how the Hasidim are described as contrasted with the Essenes in some of the New Testament time literature that they just have to be, especially with Pliny telling us that the Essenes had gone on for thousands of years. But the testaments and the experts who lived at that time said that the Essenes, the Hasidim, were fierce warriors, very strict Torah observers. Though they sided with the Maccabees at first, let's get rid of the Greeks, the Maccabees turned on them, killing many, exiling the rest. We don't really know why, except the speculation is that the Hasidim pleaded with the Maccabees to use methods that were less barbaric. I don't know if that works in a war or not. I don't know. But I think that Gregory Holsapple could probably tell me. Many of these moved to Egypt with the last Zadokite priest, went to Egypt, took his people there, his allies there. Many of the people who were of the Hasidim went with an unknown name priest, only known by the name or moniker and why am I not thinking of this now? Who's the guy in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Who started the Dead Sea Scroll communities? Moreh Emet, the Moreh Emet. For some reason, I'm losing what that means right now, but I think you've heard of the Moreh Emet. Somebody help me if you're still there. They went east instead of west to Egypt, into the wilderness to make straight the pathway for Yahweh. Hold on a second. Hello? All right, well, just park any place that it says guest. I have to turn this over to Trelly because I'm in the middle of a lesson right now, okay?
Okay.
Okay, call her up if you can.
Is she there?
Yeah, go down and see if you can find her. She doesn't know where to park. Thank you.
Okay.
So our Marcel is coming in tonight from South Florida. Marcel is one of the founding members of our group, the Vero Essene Yahad, and she lives in Tennessee. We visited her a couple months ago when Trelly and I got married. You know, we're newlyweds now. And she's come here to visit for the first time since we moved into this place in Vero Beach. So she's out here looking, can you see her? All right, you go ahead and handle it. That's a good thing about having a wife here instead of being a widower. So let me see, were I talking about the Hasidians? Okay, and I forgot where I was there. So many of these moved to Syria out into the wilderness to make way straight the way of Messiah. There is where I was. The next name I want to define is Hellenist. I already did. Those were Jews that followed Greek ways and religion. We talked about, in fact, what went on in the New Testament times with Hellenists there. And at that time in Galilee, it is said that 2/3 of the Jews in Galilee were Hellenists. But what would you do if 300 years before an army came in, took over your land and said, well, we'll let you live if you'll follow our way? I imagine in this country, if the Chinese came in here within 100 years, the people would be speaking Chinese. In fact, in Galilee, so many Jews have forgotten the Aramaic language, the Hebrew language, and just spoke Greek. Now, I know that might be surprising to you, but it's a pretty well-established fact. Jebus, Jebus. It's a town. It's the headquarters of the Jebusites. It's in Benjamin. Okay. It's the name of Jerusalem before David captured it. Now you remember. And it had another name too, Salem, Shalom. When David got it, it became Jerusalem. We don't know how. Let me stop just a second and take a look at the chat. I've been talking for 45 minutes. I can figure out how to get it. Okay. I think she thinks she's here. She's not sure. Okay. Missing the Tennessee weather. Oh, it's beautiful here. It's been a little rainy, but not much. A crazy little side menu came out of this Zoom, and I am trying to figure out how to get the chat now. I can't close. Oh, finally. You know, they're improving. They're improving Zoom so much, so often that somebody that's used it for years, like us, when we get on, there's so many changes that it's like learning all over again. Here's chat. Excuse me. Righteous teacher, teacher of righteousness. Exactly. More emet. Sometimes these things get caught on the tip of your brain. Even the Wilderness Assembly knew that. Was it Onias III, the teacher of righteousness? Probably not. Probably not. Because actually, he couldn't have been. Because as we'll find out, he was murdered. He was murdered in the temple of one of the Greek gods. He went for asylum. He knew the murderers were after him. Who were the murderers? His brother's thugs, Jason. All right, let's see. You may lose power. Vicky, are you still there? What can we do for you? You're still staying in a tent? And man, oh man, Simon the Just here is mentioned. Wow. Go ahead, Vicky.
No, I'm in my cabin.
Okay.
I just
very
might
good.
lose my electricity, and I have a wood stove, so I'm good. But if I lose my power, I'll lose my internet.
Who would you
So if
have
you don't-
carrying wood in for you?
My 2 arms and my 2 legs.
Oh, all right. Yeah, I did that for about 10 years.
Yeah,
That was
I've
tough
done it.
up
It's-
north.
It's labor intensive. There's no doubt.
It sure is. Well, I imagine, I appreciate somebody mentioning Simon the Just. He comes along a little later. Let's see if I can get this down again. Yeah, that's a new little tag on there. All right, we talked about Jebusites. Now, Jebusites were a Canaanite tribe. Their location, as before mentioned, was Jerusalem. Jebus, that's how they got their name. This is the shocker. Zadok the priest of David, becoming the high priest after David and for Solomon. Zadok the priest was a Jebusite. He was a Canaanite and a priest of the El Elyon religion, the great highest El, before being drafted, we speculate, by David. So David conquers Jebus and the Jebusite Canaanites, and it's so weird. He goes and takes the priest from their temple and makes him his chief advisor, and famous as well by George Handel and his cantata, Zadok the Priest. Some let's listen to it sometime. But that certainly was in the will of Yahweh. And this happened 800 years before the revolt we're talking about, before the Maccabees. And that whole time, the offspring, the sons of Zadok, kept the high priesthood as their ancestor was a Canaanite Jebusite. Let's talk about that a little more later, because I want to tell you a lot of things about that and why it's so important. Next, the lunisolar calendar. Now, that's the calendar of the Greek markets, adopted by the Hellenists and the post-Zadokite priests in Yehuda. The months are based on the regular cycle of the moon's phases. So lunisolar calendars are lunar calendars with, in contrast to them, additional intercalation rules being used to bring them into a rough agreement with the solar year and thus with the seasons. What I believe is that if a calendar has to be intercalated, it's not a perfect calendar. And I still stand on what I believe is the fact that the Zadokite calendar does not intercalate, not necessary. And perhaps in the 15th session or 20th session, we'll get to why. Maccabees, the Hammers, the Hasmoneans, First Maccabees 2, 1 through 5 tells us who they were. First Maccabees 2, 1 through 5. If you don't have Maccabees in your Bible, you need a better Bible. They're warriors, a warrior family of lower, poorer priests that took back the Jerusalem temple from the invading Greeks. The little horns sent Holofernes over there to the temple to raid it. Now, he was not successful, but he raised hell over there. And the Maccabees were able to offer them revenge and finally did win that war, although giving the country back to the Greeks in short order. The invasion was seen as attractive and inevitable by many Jews. Powers of the king of the East versus this little family from Modin outside of Jerusalem. Just no way any Maccabees could possibly fight this great, great power of the king of the East. Then we have, in alphabetical order, the Melchizedek, the Malach Zadok. In the earliest texts, this isn't a name, it's a title. In the earliest texts, it's written there as two words, Malach Zadok. King Zadok, or Malki Zadok, my Zadok, my righteousness. You are the king of my righteousness. A euphemism for a priest. This name becomes a prototype of the first priest of El Elyon, same as the Jebusites' God, and maybe even a title, Malach Zadok. And this is 1800 or so BC. Wouldn't it be something of the king of Salem here, Jerusalem, being the progenitor of priests all the way from himself to David? Then David taking his progeny, Zadok, the priest of the Jebusites, putting him in the leading position, and then his family goes another 800 years. Of course, that's speculation. Melchizedek and his progeny could have gone on for 1,600 years. And people today, hold on, I got to shut the door here. Did you find her? Okay. I want to tell you a secret. People today, preachers today, some of them, are claiming to be able to ordain Melchizedek priests. Oh, yes, they are. Claiming to make Joe Blow someplace a Melchizedek priest. A priest after the order of Melchizedek. That hurts me. I went out to Iowa one time, was speaking out there, and I was in with Melchizedek priests. Oh, why don't you become one? This is all you have to do. I said, honey, you can prove to me that you're a Melchizedek priest the minute I see you levitate. Because that's what the Son of Man Enoch and those who have been called Melchizedek priests did. They went up in the air or to another dimension. They were able to be interlocutors between Elohim and angels and between angels and human beings. They were mediators. Can you do that? Do you know any place where I wonder I can get ordained as a Melchizedek priest and get a badge? Next is the Miksat Ma'asa HaTorah. Now that is a text. It's also known as the MMT these days from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's a primary calendrical text. It tells you, with a little imagination, exactly how to build your Zadokite calendar and why this solar calendar is clean and perfect. In fact, the scrolls and the literature that was prohibited by the Pharisees tell us why a lunar calendar is not appropriate for our faith, Torah faith. Oh, yeah, I know what it says in there about new moons. New moons, in no place does it actually say new moons. Actually, it just says new. We understand that to be new months, not new moons, because we read in the prohibited literature that lunar calendars are actually sinful because they are breaking with the direct commandment of Yahweh. Where's that commandment? Oh, go look in Ezekiel 44. Actually, there are 4 chapters that just talk nothing about anything else but the Zadokite family and what they're supposed to do. And that they're the head of the calendar. I got that verse for you a little later. You getting tired? Okay. Miksat Ma'asa HaTorah, MMT. As I mentioned before, you want this, you put in the chat your email address, and I'll send you a copy of it. My translation. Next, the observation calendar. This is the Pharisaic feast calendar. People still use it today, a lot of them. Adopted from the calendar of Parthia, market calendar of Parthia. All right, we talked about that. The year starts depending on when the ears of barley turn green. This is the first calendar that I learned was the right one. I learned from taking a course in the Tanakh from Elder Jacob Meyer of the Assemblies of Yahweh. And their group follow the observation calendar, but it's not perfect. As we found out, I don't know, 15 years of following that, it's not perfect. When you build your own Zadokite calendar, you're going to say, hey, how easy is that? And what a matter of genius. If you're using the barley to decide when your year begins, well, you could be a month or more off. And I know we only know so much. We just got to do what we can insofar as we know. But let's look at a better way. Okay, let's define Onias the fourth. Onia, like Onia Carlson. Onias the fourth is a son of Onias the third, who led the Zadokite factions to Egypt, where he set up a new Yahweh temple in Heliopolis with the king's help, King Ptolemy. When these Zadokite priests were exiled, some of them went with Onias the fourth. He's the son of Onias the third, the last Zadokite priest who was murdered. Now, this is the Onian temple. They're in Heliopolis or Leontopolis. It lasted about 250 years. Have you ever heard of it? Not many have. 250 years before finally Romans shut it down. That is, the emperor who destroyed Israel, Vespasian, heard of this, and he said, I'm not having one of these revolts over there in Egypt. He put it down, shut it down. Can you believe that the Jerusalem temple and the Onian temple in Egypt were in competition for 250 years? Go read 2 Maccabees. I'm talking about just the beginning of it. What you'll find out there is that the temple in Jerusalem wrote a letter to the temple in Leontopolis. And in that letter, the Jerusalem temple people are nearly begging the Onian people, who were Zadokites, give up on Feast of Tabernacles. Come over here and do Hanukkah. We'll call it Feast of Tabernacles. Whatever you want to do. We want you to come here and be with us during Hanukkah. Which, what is it? Kislev, I think that's a couple of months different from Sukkot. We don't have an answer from the Onian temple, but it's pretty obvious that they said no to this. And I don't know what year this letter went in. I'm not sure that anybody does, but it would be about around this time. It would be when the Onian temple was just getting started. Oh, come on back. Come on back. You like what we're doing here. Besides, you just got a little place there. It's not big yet. Not many people know about it. But this temple in Egypt has been said to be a fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah 19. And first time some years ago, I studied Isaiah 10 through 20, looking for the prophecy of America when I used to teach prophecy. Now, look, I read what it says at the end of Isaiah 19, and knowing some of this history already, I about fell down. I said, why isn't this verse used to show us that the prophecies of Yahweh are not failing? Look, in that day, verse 18, there'll be 5 cities in the land of Egypt, that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to Yahweh Sabaoth, that is the commander of armies. One of these will be called Sun City. That's the earliest reading. Later readings put in there the city of destruction. Sun City. Why do you think the Masoretes put in city of destruction? Because they were so, them being Pharisees, were so not liking what this prophecy said that somewhere along the line, they put in destruction instead of Sun City, Heliopolis, because that's exactly where the Onion temple was. Heliopolis, Sun City. Just amazing reflection of prophecy that everybody ought to know about. My Elohim is mighty, and he's able to tell us all things. There's a little about Onias the Fourth, the leader of the Onion temple. In fact, there are so many Jews that came to that temple that they called it after the name of Onias, and they called it Onion Kingdom. Oh, we're getting to the end of these definitions, so I'll let you off then. We'll do this again. Ptolemy, that's the king of Egypt by virtue of being the sovereign of the Ptolemaic Empire, which was Egypt at that time. They're the ones that paid for Onias the Fourth to come over there and start that temple in Heliopolis, and I'm sure that these Onion Zadokites pointed out for King Ptolemy this prophetic scripture from Isaiah 19:18. I'm sure that would do it. And Ptolemy was the king, inherited kingship of this Ptolemaic Empire that I mentioned, was the empire to the west of Israel, mostly Egypt. Here's the Sadducees. Here's a matter of confusion for a lot of people. The title of the post-Zadokite Hellenist priests, you know enough about this now to know that they got kicked out. Some went to Egypt, some went to Syria, and their allies. Sadducees, I think I explained this whole thing. This word derives from the Greek meaning, the same as Zadokites, but in Greek it's not Zadok, it's Sadok. S, or S, shin, kind of S, Shadok. Yet these people were not of the family of Zadok at all, and thus not to be allowed to be a priesthood, yet they took the Greek transliteration of the name of the Zadokites to describe themselves. So now we have Zadokites, and we've got Sadducees, fake Zadokites. I'm sure that there are plenty of examples of other religious people doing this. Not too sure. And the Seleucid Empire, which we talked about, the empire to the east, comprising mostly old Syria. And I want to show you a map, if anybody's left here. I know, I get a little long-winded and boring. How come this isn't showing up? Well, that's something. Maybe I can take this thing. It's not showing up in screen share. Nothing's showing up out here. On my screen share, nothing except whiteboard. And that's not helping me. Maybe I can just get you to it here. And maybe not. I'm sorry, just not cooperating. Let me say, in your mind, a picture of Israel from your Bible, back of your Bible. All right. Well, at the time this picture was made, Israel was being ruled by the Ptolemaic Empire of Egypt. And so if you look to the left, where all the civilization is in Egypt, that's the Ptolemaic Empire, run by one of Alexander's generals and the family that of his descendants. And if you go to the right of Israel, across the Jordan River, there we have the Seleucid Empire. These are both huge. And the Seleucid Empire, if you recall your Roman history, was always the great enemy of Rome. They fought and fought all the time. And what did they call that? Parthia, the land of the Pharisees or Pharisees. Okay, so they didn't like Rome, but they liked Israel. What I understand is many of the Magoi, the Magi of Parthia, that's where they came from, these three kings of Orient are coming over from Parthia, and they didn't come alone. They came with a big old army. No wonder Herod was flipping out about it. One author says they came with about 20,000, and the Magi had all been of Israel in dispersion. They had a second government in Parthia that was an Israel government. That's why they wanted in Parthia to take that back. Yahshua was not visited by Casper and the other Bel, whatever they are, the names of those guys. He was visited by an army. It sounds appropriate. It sounds appropriate when you think of it. Stephen Collins, he wrote a book called Parthia, worth reading. But I'll cue you one thing: if you buy one, it falls apart. Make sure you're ready. Keep the receipt and get another one. All right, so I can't show you the map, but I can tell you a little more. I've only got a couple more here. I'm down to the Z's. Anything worth doing again? Oh, let's look at Zadok the priest one more time. Prophecy and divine direction for the people from Yahweh regarding the Zadokites and their allies is found in Ezekiel 40 through 44. The whole thing. They are to rule every bit of the religion forever. Ezekiel 44:23, though, especially, I picked that one out. It says, the sons of Zadok shall direct my people to distinguish between the holy and the profane, and they shall inform them the difference between the unclean and the clean. In a controversy, it is they who shall officiate in judgment in accord with my ordinances. Thus they will judge it. My laws and my statutes shall they observe at all my appointed times. Right there it is. Who composes the calendar? According to Yahweh, your Elohim. My laws and my statutes shall they observe at all my appointed times. That's a calendar. And my Sabbath shall they honor. Ezekiel 44:23, that's the concordant version, a tremendous version of the Tanakh that you'll just at least want to look at online. If you want to translate your Bible yourself and you don't know Hebrew, that's the one to get. I'm telling you. So the Zadok family, according to Yahweh, reigned from about 1000 BC. I'm going to say even more than that. That's the time of David. 1000 BC to 177 BC, approximately 800 years. And as I mentioned, if Zadok is a progeny of Melchizedek, then it was twice that much, 1600 years. All right, I'm going to cut it off at this time. You've been here an hour and 20 minutes. When we come back, well, when should we come back? We can say next Thursday. If you want to continue on this, I will give you a choice. We either can just get right into the calendar, or we can do one more segment on this history. There's a lot of little things here that maybe you find important, or maybe you find at least interesting. I sure have. And I'm going to talk about the Jebusite hypothesis, purporting to prove that Zadok was the high priest of the worship place at Jebus, later Jerusalem, when David, during his capture of the city, engaged him as a second high priest of Israel. Yes, it's true. Go back and read. He rose to the first of the priesthood when David exiled Abiathar for sedition. What this required is the identity of El Elyon and that of Yahweh were found to be the same. It says that the Jebusites worshiped El Elyon. Melchizedek worshiped El Elyon. These guys in Jerusalem that had come in, these Davidids, they were worshiping Yahweh. Look what happened to the Bible. You know, you got the documentary hypothesis, which I'm sure is no hypothesis, it's a fact. We have El Elyon speaking in there, and we have Yahweh speaking in there in different places. They're the same, just known by different titles. This is certainly what David came up with. Else, how could a Canaanite priest be appointed to a position in a Yahwist place of worship and remain there in family for 1600 years? Any questions or comments? As my old boss used to say, are you enjoying? Are you enjoying? Well, I hope so. So we'll do this again next Thursday night, and you can choose which you want. Just learn to make that calendar. But look, what good is it just to learn to make the calendar if you don't know why? If you don't have the background on it or the history? Remember the short story. That will always help you. And I thank you, and I wish you a good night.